Ever heard of a theory that connects patriarchy, our relationship with animals, and even what we eat?
Like how those things all sit together.
Exactly. Get ready, because today's deep dive is all about challenging what we think we know about history. We're going deep into Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess by Dr. M. Seenarine.
Ah, Dr. Seenarine. His work is fascinating because he doesn't just look at the rise of patriarchy like it happened in a vacuum.
Right, he connects it to other stuff.
He links it to this chain reaction that started way back in human history with the domestication of animals. But, it's not just the simple dogs helped us hunt kind of story.
There's got to be more to it than that.
He argues that each step in domestication had a ripple effect.
Like a domino effect, changing things as it went.
Exactly. Ultimately shaping power dynamics and how we relate to the natural world.
Okay, so dominoes falling. Where does this all begin?
He starts with what he calls the domestication of male apes.
Whoa, hold on. Domestication of male apes.
It sounds provocative, right? Right, but he's really talking about the long process of evolution that led to us, to modern humans.
Okay, so our ancestors, basically.
He compares us to other primates, orangutans, gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and he argues that early humans, in a way, they domesticated themselves.
Wait, humans domesticated themselves.
It's like instead of some outside force taming us, it was an internal shift within our species, happening over a really, really long time.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So, how did we domesticate ourselves?
Well, think about it. Domesticated animals, they often have certain traits. Reduced aggression, maybe they're more docile. Dr. Seenarine suggests early human males might have gone through something similar, becoming more inclined to cooperate, to form social groups.
Interesting. So, we're talking about a shift in behavior, a move toward being more social.
And that shift, that's what set the stage for later domestication, where humans started to control other species.
Okay, I'm following you. So, we've got domesticated humans. How does that lead to, say, the domestication of fire? That seems like a huge GE jump.
Yeah, from taming our inner ape to taming fire, right? This is where Seenarine's argument gets really cool. He sees controlling fire not just as some, technological thing.
But as something bigger, something more significant.
Yeah. He sees it as a pivotal moment in the shift towards male dominance. He says fire, it wasn't just about warmth and cooking, it was power, light, protection. And those things were mostly controlled by men.
That makes sense. I mean, think about it. In tons of cultures, women were the keepers of the hearth, the ones tending the fire at home.
Right, exactly.
Is he saying that men taking control of fire directly caused women to have less influence?
It's not quite that direct, but there's a connection. See, with fire, men became more dominant in food prep.
Which, let's be real, is a big deal in any society.
Huge. And since food is so central, controlling it affected the whole social structure. And that brings us to the next domestication. Wolves, our canine pals.
Wolves. Okay, so we've gone from self-domesticated humans to fire, now to wolves. This is a wild ride. It's not the typical picture of early humans we're used to.
Definitely not. See, Dr. Seenarine, he challenges this old idea that men were always the hunters and providers.
Yeah, like man the mighty hunter, that whole thing.
Exactly. He points to evidence that early humans, especially women, they relied a lot on plants. Women were really important gathering food, even in early agriculture.
Right. He talks about those ancient goddess figurines, the female imagery in prehistoric art, like those amazing Venus figurines. It suggests that women were way more important than we often give them credit for.
Totally. One of the best examples is Çatalhöyük.
Çatalhöyük, that's that ancient city, right?
Yeah. One of the earliest examples of urban planning we've found. And it wasn't some warlike fortress. It was this bustling city all about agriculture, art, and guess what? Female deities. It really throws a wrench in that man the hunter narrative.
It really does. So we've got fire, we've got wolves, which he links to a shift in power. What's next in this domestication lineup?
Next up is domesticating crops,
Okay, crops, like the start of agriculture.
which is usually seen as the big thing that led to settled societies.
So how do we get from wolves to wheat? Give me the controversial take.
He builds on the idea we were just talking about women's roles. He argues that women were probably the pioneers of early agriculture, remember Çatalhöyük? But as societies became more settled, more hierarchical, the benefits and control of farming, they shifted toward men.
So not a sudden takeover, but a gradual shift. Like men took over something women had a huge hand in developing.
Exactly. He says that the food surplus from farming combined with more control over domesticated animals.
They created a kind of power vacuum.
And men were in the perfect position to fill it.
So that's 4 domestications down, and I can already see how these events could have shifted things in a big way. What are the last 3? How do they solidify the rise of patriarchy?
You know, it's kind of heavy to think that things from so long ago still affect us today.
I know what you mean. It's a lot. But I think it's good to understand how these power structures came about, you know? Maybe then we can actually do something about them.
Exactly. And that's where ecogenocentrism comes in.
Yeah.
It's a big word, but it's important in his theory.
Right, ecogenocentrism. What is it exactly?
It describes a social structure where respect for nature and female leadership were like the top priorities.
Yeah.
And Dr. Seenarine says this wasn't some rare thing.
It wasn't.
He says it was normal in many early human societies.
So, not a utopia, but a real thing. What did these societies actually look like?
Imagine a world where women were not just respected for having children, but revered for their wisdom, for their connection to nature. As healers, artists, leaders.
Wow.
Dr. Seenarine describes societies that valued cooperation and sustainability, not just competition and domination.
He talks about the worship of earth goddesses too, right?
Exactly, those female deities who embodied nature's power. He looks at all the archaeological and anthropological evidence for these cultures. He said these cultures weren't all the same. They were complex, always changing. But they all had a deep respect for the earth and feminine principles.
It makes you rethink this idea that we went straight from primitive societies to civilizations with patriarchy as the outcome, like it was destined to happen.
And that's Dr. Seenarine's point. He says the rise of patriarchy wasn't inevitable, but a process driven by specific things that happened.
So if these ecogenecentric societies were so great, what happened? What made them decline?
That is the million-dollar question. Dr. Seenarine argues that it was a combination of factors, a perfect storm, and the domestication of animals made things worse.
Okay, so that brings us back to those last 3 domestications. Ruminants, horses, and, well, women, which is a tough one to hear, frankly.
It's definitely challenging.
Let's start with ruminants. Most people probably think of cows as peaceful, grazing in a field. How do they play into this?
Right. Who thinks of cows as changing society?
Hmm.
But Dr. Seenarine points out that there's a link between owning cattle and the decline of matrilineal societies, especially in Africa.
Right, he talks about that. He says that cattle ended up like a currency, a source of wealth that men controlled.
Exactly. And this control over such important resources shifted the balance of power.
Contributing to the decline of those female-centric societies.
It's like cows accidentally helped create this new social order.
Okay, so we have fire, crops, now cattle, men taking control of more and more essential resources. Where do horses fit in?
Dr. Seenarine argues that horses, with their speed and strength, really changed warfare, trade, and even land ownership.
Okay, but horses are more like a tool, a weapon, than a resource, aren't they?
That's how we usually see them, but he digs deeper. He argues that men were mostly the ones who domesticated and trained horses. So they had a monopoly, not just on horses themselves, but what they represented: mobility, power, military might.
And he even connects that to
Control over women and their roles.
which brings us to that final and most unsettling domestication, the domestication of women.
It's a tough one to wrap your head around.
Because domestication usually means taming something wild, right?
Exactly. He says that as men got more powerful, they wanted to control women in the same way.
So it wasn't an overnight thing, but a gradual shift in power.
Right, expectations changing over generations.
So it's not just about physical control then. It's about limiting women's freedom to make their own choices.
Absolutely. He points to the rise of patriarchal laws and customs where women were seen as property. He connects it directly to animal breeding.
It's a disturbing comparison. Are you saying that by learning to control animals to manipulate nature, we open the door for the subjugation of women?
That's the core of his argument. And he says it wasn't just physical or social, but psychological and spiritual too. He says women's roles as healers, artists, spiritual leaders were suppressed, replaced by male-dominated institutions. He even called it the Great Fall of Women.
And he ties this to another change, our diet, this shift from plants to animals. How does that fit in?
He argues it wasn't just about what tasted good. He says relying more on meat changed how we saw animals, turning them into commodities. And it led to a more aggressive view of the world.
So food wasn't just fuel, it was a symbol of power. You're saying that what we eat today could be a result of this ancient power struggle.
Yeah, it's something to think about, right? But remember, he's not saying one specific diet is the answer. He's just showing how our food choices reflect our values.
That's what makes his work so interesting. He's making us question what we think we know. But before we go too far down that road, I want to make sure we talk about his ideas for a better future. He doesn't just leave us stuck in this patriarchal system, does he? Okay, so we've covered some really intense stuff.
Yeah.
Going from those early domestications to the idea of women being domesticated too?
It's a lot, right? But the good news is Dr. Seenarine doesn't just point out the problems. He talks about solutions too.
Exactly. He sees a path towards a better future. Where do we even begin with that, though? Untangling thousands of years of ingrained patriarchy.
It's a big task, no doubt. Dr. Seenarine says it starts with a big shift in our thinking, going back to those ecogenocentric values.
Back to the beginning. Respect for nature. Seeing how everything's connected. Valuing feminine principles. Compassion. Cooperation. Sustainability. It's like a reset button for how we see ourselves in the world.
That's a good way to put it. He wants us to step outside that man versus nature story, that idea that we're separate from nature and can just use it however we want.
He's talking about the environmental crisis too, isn't he? It's not just a social issue.
Exactly. He connects those dots. He says the same mindset that leads to dominating women and exploiting animals is what's hurting the planet. We can't fix one without fixing the others.
Which brings us back to domestication. If that was such a turning point, how do we move on from it? Is he suggesting we all go vegan?
It's interesting. He recognizes how complex our relationship with animals is, how ingrained it is in our cultures, our traditions. He doesn't want to give a one-size-fits-all answer.
So it's not about everyone becoming vegetarian or going back to living in caves.
Right? It's about starting a conversation, encouraging people to really think about these things.
Yeah.
He asks, what if we saw animals not just as commodities, but as beings who deserve respect and compassion? What if we challenge the whole hierarchy that puts humans at the top?
He poses a lot of what-ifs.
He does. Tough ones, but important ones. He wants us to examine how we're part of these systems, to reduce our consumption, support sustainable agriculture, advocate for ethical treatment of animals, all of it.
He even talks about rewilding. What does that even mean? Are we releasing all the cows and sheep?
It's more of a metaphor, like women are reclaiming their power, challenging the old norms. He says we need to re-examine how we relate to the wild, both inside ourselves and out in the world. It's about embracing things that are complex, diverse, things we can't easily categorize or control.
So maybe it's not about more control, but about rediscovering those old ways of being where we honored the interconnectedness of all life. It's a big idea.
It is, and it requires us to question everything, to challenge those deep assumptions we have about power, progress, our place in the natural world.
It's about unlearning as much as it is about learning. Well, on that note, we come to the end of our deep dive into Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess. A huge thank you to Dr. Seenarine for his work, and a big thank you to you for listening in and exploring these ideas with us. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into uncharted territory. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and take care.